Welcome to the Buffalo Niagara Partnership's 2019-2020 annual report. I'm Dottie Gallagher, President and CEO of the Buffalo Niagara Partnership, and I want to thank all of you for being here this morning and for believing in the work of the Buffalo Niagara Partnership. Come together today in uncertain times and in an unconventional way. This program usually concludes our fiscal year in late June, and of course, we are usually meeting in person, making new connections and taking comfort in the familiar faces we see. But COVID-19 has changed all of that and so much more. But despite the challenges that lie ahead, there's a lot to be thankful for, and that's what we're going to focus on this morning. And there's no better place to start than with an appreciation of our members, especially those making this morning possible. Today's event would not be possible without the support of our sponsors. It's my pleasure to acknowledge them now. KeyBank, our title sponsor. We will hear from Gary Quenneville, KeyBank's Upstate New York Regional Executive and Buffalo Market President later in this morning's program. Univera Healthcare, our event sponsors, Elderwood, Lumsden McCormick, and National Grid, and our supporting sponsors, First Amherst Development Group and St. Bonaventure University. Again, thank you to our sponsors. The BNP is fortunate to be served by a dedicated group of board members, and many of them are with us this morning. I'm going to stop our presentation momentarily so you can see the faces of our board members in attendance today. So let's take a look. Who's here?
Just you, Dottie.
Just me? Can we see it? No, you're probably in speaker view. All of our board members, you can wave. Great. And at this time, I'm going to introduce the chairman of the partnership's board of directors, Art Wingerter, president of Univera Healthcare, today's presenting sponsor.
Thank you, Dottie, and welcome to today's event. Thank you for investing the time to be with us this morning as we look back at the Buffalo Niagara Partnership's service to our members and contributions to our community over the last year and a half. Univera is proud to be this morning's presenting sponsor. Univera cares about this community, and that is why we support the work of the Buffalo Niagara Partnership. We are especially proud of how the Buffalo Niagara Partnership has served our community, members and non-members, during what has been an especially trying time for business and employers of all stripes and sizes. I have said this before, but now it seems especially relevant in these times. If the partnership, who? As we officially close 1 year and look ahead to the next, I have the pleasure of recognizing some of our board members, parting board members. Our board members are the biggest champions and contribute a tremendous amount of time and energy to the partnership. I want to thank the following board members for their service to our organization as they step off the board: Jeremy Connor, Holly Gagnon, John Hurley, Kevin Murphy, Ram Ramajan, and Robert Zach. I want to thank and acknowledge two gentlemen who are coming off the board after 22 years of service. They'll be greatly missed, and they made an incredible impact in this business. Warren Colville and Tim Loftus. Both Warren and Tim, who served as past chairman, have left an indelible mark on this organization, as we are deeply grateful to them. I also want to acknowledge the newest board members. I want to acknowledge the newest members to the board: Jim Dettinger, Easy Ugwa, Ofo Easy Ugwa, Nora Fletcher, Ted Janicki, and Camille Joseph Goldman. Scott Pallotta, James Rooney, Rupa Shanmugren, Stephen Tucker, and Tom Wiley. Please join me in welcoming the new board members. At this time, I'm pleased to turn the program back to Dottie.
Thank you, Art, and thank you for taking the hard part of the program, pronouncing everybody's names. So appreciate that. Thank you so much. We start this morning with a confession of sorts. We've been keeping a secret for months, and this morning we're letting the cat out of the bag. I am both very pleased and super proud to announce that the U.S. Chamber of Commerce has awarded the BNP with a 5-star accreditation, its highest recognition for our sound policies, effective organizational procedures, and positive impact on the Buffalo Niagara community. Only 3 other chambers in all of New York State are accredited at any level by the U.S. Chamber. This acknowledgement came earlier this year after a rigorous months-long review looking at our operations, governance, and technology capabilities. This designation would not have been possible without the hard work of our staff, especially our CFO, Anita Genovese, who quarterbacked our very huge and significant application. I also want to thank our board of directors for their support in this effort. This 5-star accreditation is a badge of honor as we continue our mission to connect and mobilize the region's employers and advocate for economic growth and opportunity in Buffalo Niagara. The U.S. Chamber sees real value in what we do, and so do you as we continue this year to convene members around key issues impacting employers and developing new ways to bring timely and topical information directly to you. Our events move seamlessly to a virtual format, providing our members with enhanced access to and insights from industry experts and thought leaders, allowing members to stay up to date on a variety of topics and pressing business issues. Much of this programming is now a part of a growing repository of member-only content that is available as a benefit of membership through the portal on our website, giving all members, regardless of your schedule, access to our programming and events. Also new this year, our programming works harder for you. The BNP has officially been named an authorized recertification provider by the Society for Human Resource Management, or SHRM. With this certification, participants in our qualified educational trainings and other HR-related programming can receive professional development credits. And I want to pause for just 1 second here to let our board members know if you want to turn off your cameras at this time, you're welcome to do so. The pandemic did not slow down the BNP's ongoing commitment to creating awareness around the benefits of having a diverse and inclusive regional business climate. This year, we created new programs designed to advance best practices in this important work. In doing so, we are enabling employers to leverage diversity for a competitive advantage and promote a workplace of culture of inclusion and equity. Just a few weeks ago, the BNP released Employing Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in Western New York. This report and assessment findings come at a time when Buffalo Niagara, New York State, and the United States continue to deal with a reckoning on race relations and the shortcomings in creating economic opportunity for all. An extension of the BNP's diversity and inclusion programs and initiatives, this assessment compiled the sentiments of employers of various sizes throughout Western New York, representing several major industries. The data was statistically significant and can be applied to the Buffalo Niagara employer community as a whole, something other much larger communities have been able to accomplish. And the assessment provided some hopeful signs. 72% of businesses report having started on their diversity, equity, and inclusion journeys. But as we know, that journey can be a very long road. Only 5% of respondents report having actually achieved their goals related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that chasm is where both the challenge and the hard work lie. The assessment will be essential to monitoring our progress and helping us steer past the obstacles and navigate towards our shared goals. I want to publicly thank the Community Foundation for Greater Buffalo, the Walmart Foundation, and an anonymous group of local business leaders for their generous support that made this assessment possible. I also want to thank our members for embracing our full slate of D&I programming, including our D&I Academy, virtual learning series, and executive exchange, as well as the racial healing circles we hosted this year, which allowed for safe and engaging conversations about race during this crucial time for our community. The BNP's commitment to assisting regional employers in achieving their diversity, equity, and inclusion goals runs deep because we know that the future economic vitality of our region depends on it. The pandemic has highlighted how important it is that government employers work together to keep our community strong and prosperous. As the voice of the Western New York employers, the BNP continued to set itself apart through effective advocacy and collaborative economic development initiatives. At the local, state, and federal level, the BNP is engaged, making sure elected officials know what will boost or blunt job creation and private investment in our community. We also continue our key role of connecting the region's employers to both each other and regional policymakers to share best practices, key insights, and timely data to support Western New York's established and emerging industries both before and during the pandemic. The pandemic has tested employers and their employees in ways almost unimaginable. COVID-19 forced businesses to close their doors to the public, workforces to pivot to remote operations, employers to redesign manufacturing floors and office layouts to keep people safe, and small business owners to question their economic viability moving forward. And we see that's even more so today as we move into the orange zones in Erie County. During this unprecedented time, the BNP's work became a critical lifeline as we worked around the clock to inform, guide, and mobilize employers when they needed it most. Through that work, the BNP has provided 2,000 employers with some form of direct service, engaged over 4,200 people in our programming, sent more than 192,000 business bulletins, and seen more than 4,000 page views on our COVID-19 resource pages. The BNP organized a series of roundtables with New York State Lieutenant Governor Kathy Hochul as the state developed reopening guidance, and more than 250 leaders from the construction, development, manufacturing, professional services, restaurant, retail, and tourism hospitality industries shared their perspectives directly with the Lieutenant Governor on how they wish to safely reopen and resume business operations. The BNP kept our members and policymakers connected as government action or inaction mattered more than ever. Events with U.S. Senator Chuck Schumer, Congressman Brian Higgins, and New York State Comptroller Tom DiNapoli and New York State Majority Leader Andrea Stewart-Cousins offered timely insights and allowed members to ask questions directly to them, the people in power. As you all know, COVID-19 brought countless legal, human resources, and compliance questions to the forefront, and the BNP was there every step of the way, hosting dozens of virtual programs to provide members with the information and understanding they needed to navigate the pandemic. We continue to be there with a webinar on the state's new travel policy earlier this week and a bulletin that we launched yesterday afternoon about the impacts of going orange in Erie County. We created Keep Buffalo Niagara Working so employers could turn to just one place to access the latest information, guidelines, and resources to find answers to their questions and recommendations for how to safely reopen and operate their business to protect their employees and customers during the pandemic. And we organized the Western New York COVID-19 Business Impact Survey to better gauge the true effect of the pandemic on Western New York's businesses and economy. More than 1,600 regional employers took part. The responses were shared with regional leaders and decision makers to best focus and prioritize assistance programs and legislative efforts. While not surprising, the results were still sobering. 93% of respondents experienced revenue decline. 3 out of 5 businesses reported postponing investment, and more than a third reduced staff. I want to thank Buffalo, Niagara Falls, Erie County, Niagara County, and nearly 20 chambers and economic development organizations for working with us on this important impact survey. I also want to thank so many of our members for sending BNP virtual kudos over the last many months. Your encouragement and appreciation really made a difference. It has inspired our team and helped us remember what is at stake. And I want to pause for just a second here, and I want to recognize and thank every single member of the Buffalo Niagara Partnership staff. All that work that you just heard about was done by 14 people around the clock, talented, dedicated, hardworking people really committed to our region. And I want to thank them personally from the bottom of my heart and on behalf of all of our members. And helping Buffalo Niagara remember what's at stake was the genesis of the It's Our Job campaign. And the campaign's origins prove that sometimes good things happen because of social media. Jeff Papalardo, Chief Creative Officer at Crowley Webb, put this message out to the universe, offering up his unique talents in times of real trouble. Little did Jeff know that we would take him up on his offer, and it turned into much more than a sign, but a whole campaign to benefit the community. And I want to thank Jeff, Matt Lowe, and all of the Crowley Webb team for what they've done and what they are continuing to do to help us get this message out to the community. The goal of the campaign is to encourage Western New Yorkers to do their part to keep the economy running and ensure the safety of our neighbors. That message was never more important as winter sets in and we enter this next critical phase of the pandemic. It's Our Job is focused on 2 major tenets, encouraging consumers to do their part to keep local businesses open by buying local, and asking consumers and business owners alike to practice COVID-conscious habits that curb the spread of the virus, like social distancing, washing hands, and wearing a mask. Through the support of a grant from Univera Healthcare, BNP produced 2,500 small business kits. These kits included tools such as signage, floor markings, and masks to help business owners operate safely and welcome customers back in the face of the COVID-19 pandemic. Representatives from Bank on Buffalo, Evans Bank, Key Bank, M&T Bank, and Northwest Bank delivered the kits for us to each of their small business clients, and we really appreciate their support. And BNP members and non-members alike helped us spread the word. The adoption of the It's Our Job campaign has been beyond what we could have imagined, and we've made a little presentation to help you to celebrate it. Let's take a look. I think we're having a sound issue, or am I having a sound issue? Can you get a little louder, Allie? No.
It's important to spend our dollars at locally owned businesses because supporting our neighbors and making sure our Western New York stays bright and vital, it's our job. Learn more at thepartnership.org/ourjob.
I want to take a moment to acknowledge the generosity of several organizations that made the success of the It's Our Job campaign possible. Together, these organizations have provided over $750,000 of promotional support. And I want to begin by thanking the Buffalo News, who alone provided over $400,000 in advertising and promotional support for this campaign. And I want to thank Crowley Webb, who did all of the creative for the campaign, continues to help us, Univera Healthcare, WGRZ, Tops Friendly Markets, the Niagara Frontier Transportation Authority, Zenger Group, and AdPro Sports. These business leaders have made a real difference in the community by investing in this project, and we really, really thank you. In addition to the work we have done to date to help local businesses navigate the impacts of COVID-19 and the work we have done to keep the economy open through the It's Our Job campaign, the partnership has developed a plan to rebuild our economy moving forward that we call Keep Buffalo Niagara Working. This 2-year plan has several elements, including engaging the community in our efforts to keep the economy moving, employer advocacy, building equity into our economic recovery, and addressing the significant needs this community will have about our workforce. The partnership will not be immune to the impacts of COVID-19 on our operations. We are supported by membership dollars and revenue we earn from our events and programs. We know that there are some members that will not be able to support us the way they have in years past. We are also challenged by the cancellation of live events that began last March and will continue for the foreseeable future. And yet we have critical work to do to help rebuild the economy. In recognition of those realities, many of our members that are able to have committed to do even more for the Buffalo Niagara Partnership to quite literally keep Buffalo Niagara working. We've set a goal of raising $1.3 million to assist our organization in navigating the impacts of COVID on our organization. And I'm so proud to tell you that we are 75% of the way there, thanks to the following employers who are stepping up even beyond their annual support to the partnership. And I want to thank them now. The Ralph C. Wilson Jr. Foundation and the Walmart Foundation, M&T Bank and Blue Cross Blue Shield, Tops Friendly Markets, Moog and Independent Health, Wegmans, Life Storage, Hodgson Russ and Triad Distributing, Dobkins and Company, NOCO, Walsh Duffield, Zenger Group, Hunt Real Estate, Rich Products, West Her, and National Grid. And the donations keep rolling in since yesterday. We've also received generous donations from MVP, Power Drives, Uniland, and a company that would like to remain anonymous. So thank you to all of you. And while I'm confident about the future of the BNP, I know we all have uncertainty about what the future holds for our regional economy. And that's exactly why we thought we would take some time this morning to get an expert economic forecast. To introduce our guest, it's my pleasure to introduce Partnership Board Member and former Chair, Gary Quenneville. Gary is Upstate New York Regional Executive and Buffalo Market President with KeyBank, today's title sponsor. Welcome, Gary.
Thank you, Dottie. Congratulations on the accreditation, you and the team, and really incredible accomplishment given the events of 2020. So great work. Thanks for doing that on behalf of all of us that are members of the partnership. Good morning, everybody. It's great to see so many people here for the annual report to members. Even though we can't be together, we're happy to bring you this important event virtually. As with all of you, Key is committed to helping this region carry forward, especially during very challenging times. Like the partnership slogan says, it's our job to keep Western New York as open as is responsibly possible and vital as we continue to fight COVID-19. During the past several months, we joined several community partners, including many on this meeting, in contributing to the Western New York COVID-19 Fund. And our collective efforts are helping essential organizations with funding that's designed to complement public sector funds being given to assist in areas of healthcare, human services, food, childcare, and support for frontline responders, with the goal that we come back stronger than ever. It's been a year in which we've really had to pivot in terms of how we all pull together to support these needed efforts. And now I would like to introduce our guest speaker, Jason Abel. It's my pleasure to be able to do so today. Jason is an Assistant Vice President and Head of Regional Analysis at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. His primary research interests are in the fields of urban and regional economics, industrial organization, the economics of innovation, and public finance. His work has been published in leading academic journals and featured by a number of prominent media outlets, including The Economist, The New York Times, USA Today, The Wall Street Journal. He holds a PhD in economics from The Ohio State University and a bachelor's degree in economics from the State University of New York at Geneseo. Jason, it's my pleasure to turn the program over to you. Welcome.
Well, good morning and thanks. Let me load my presentation here. There we go. Okay, hopefully that's visible to everybody. So again, thanks for the invitation. It's really great to be here. I wish we could all be together. Let's make a point of putting a date on the calendar sometime in 2021 when we can all get together in person and talk about all the progress that's been made over the course of the year. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to provide an analysis of the Buffalo economy during the pandemic. It's going to be a very data-driven presentation. I'm going to run through a number of indicators to give you a sense of how we look at the economy and what we're seeing right now. So of course, before getting too far down the pike, I have to say that the views I'm going to express today are my own and not necessarily those of the New York Fed or the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. So let me start off and give you an overview of the key points that I'm going to try to get across today. And let me just start by, addressing, what's on everyone's mind right now in the Buffalo region, especially in light of, most of the region being moved into the orange zone and new parts of the region being moved into the yellow zone yesterday. So while coronavirus cases were fairly contained in the Buffalo area earlier in the pandemic, the region is now experiencing a rapid surge in the spread of the disease. And this is creating considerable uncertainty about the near-term economic outlook. I think we're in a very serious situation here. And in my view, as an economist, first and foremost, I think we have a public health crisis on our hands. And I don't think it's going to be possible to get the economy back to full strength or even close to being back to full strength without first getting this health crisis under control. I think it's actually a false narrative to suggest we have to choose between our health and our wealth. So what do we actually know about what's happened so far? So following an unprecedented contraction in the spring with the onset of the pandemic, regional economic activity rebounded pretty sharply over the summer, actually much more sharply than most forecasters had projected. Though what we're seeing as we enter the fall is that the pace of recovery has slowed. And importantly, and this is a really important point to keep in mind, even with the rebound that we've seen so far, which has been substantial, business activity, consumer spending, and employment all remain well below pre-pandemic levels. So what this means is we have a hole in the economy that still needs to be filled. And then last, in terms of just a little bit of a bright spot in the regional economy, Buffalo's housing market has actually held up pretty well through the pandemic. And this is really true across the country. We've continued to see home prices rise at a pretty solid clip. All right, so before getting into what's happening right now, I think it's important to take a step back and take a look at economic conditions before the pandemic. Right, so this was a period of time where we had longest sustained expansion on record, a decade of growth. Unemployment rates were at record lows, 50-year lows. Wage growth had hit and had been sustained at above 3% for a fairly significant period of time. By all measures, we had a really strong labor market and a strong economy. You can see in this chart here, which is showing employment trends for New York City, the US, and Buffalo, this gray shaded area, and any gray shaded areas throughout the presentation refer to recessionary periods. This is the Great Recession as designated by the National Bureau of Economic Research. You can see that the New York City economy had actually experienced an historically strong expansion. Now, the Buffalo economy was not growing as strongly as the US or New York City, but actually the experience through the Great Recession and after was actually pretty favorable for the region. The region went into recession a bit later than most of the rest of the country. The downturn here was not nearly as deep. And actually, the region had gained back all the jobs that were lost during the Great Recession by around 2014 or 15. That's a pattern that hadn't happened in previous downturns. So all things considered, we were on solid footing before the pandemic hit. All right, so what this chart shows is daily new cases on a 7-day moving average of the coronavirus. Now, there's a lot of measurement errors with this information, especially early on in the pandemic, before testing had really gotten as widespread as it is now. But overall, I think it helps you visualize what the magnitude and the path of the pandemic has been so far. And in late February, early March, you can see that New York City had emerged as the epicenter of the pandemic. Virus cases were really just out of control. Now, New York State stepped in late March, in April, and took pretty drastic actions to shut down non-essential businesses and to order households to stay at home. And as you can see, the consequence of that is that the virus subsided quite substantially. And while in the summer months, while most of the rest of the country was experiencing a second wave of the pandemic, here in New York, the virus was pretty well contained. Now, what's pretty clear is that we're now entering a third wave of the pandemic. And unfortunately, this time around, the region is not being spared. It's going to be part of the third wave. Now, how does Buffalo stack up in this picture? All right, so this red line shows what's happening in Buffalo. And this is probably not news to many on the presentation today. Early in the pandemic, the virus was fairly contained. It was a bit higher here in Buffalo than other parts of upstate New York and even in the US more generally. But again, because of some of those actions that were taken in addition to people's own behavior, over the summer months, it was pretty well contained in the Buffalo area. Recently, though, we've seen a surge in cases. Buffalo now, on a per capita basis, is actually worse in the state. Now, there is a little bit of good news here. If you take a look at the very end of this period, we're actually starting to see a little bit of a plateauing in virus counts. So what that means is that we're not seeing the rise that we were seeing over the past couple of weeks. But this is still a very high level of cases. It is, a very concerning trend. All right, so what's been the economic fallout of the coronavirus pandemic? Right, so in order to get the most current read on economic conditions, I like to turn to our regional business surveys. We have 2 of them. What I'm showing you here is for our Empire State Manufacturing Survey. This is a survey of manufacturers in New York State. Some of you who are participating today may actually be part of this survey. This is what I'm showing you is our headline diffusion index, right? And the way that interpret this is that readings above 0 are consistent with a growing economy. Readings below 0 are consistent with a contraction. You can see during the Great Recession, we were seeing these negative numbers indicating we were in decline at that point. All right, so fast forward to where we are now, and we are actually officially in a recession again as per the NBER. You can see that the speed and magnitude of the contraction following the pandemic in March was much more severe than during the Great Recession. A very, very sharp contraction, unprecedented. Now, since then, we have had some rebound. So the index shot back up to 0 and now has been in slightly positive territory for manufacturers for some time. Now, when some people look at this chart, they're tempted to think that what this means is that we've had this big, sharp decline in activity, but now we're right back where we were. But that's not how you interpret a diffusion index. The way you think about a diffusion index is that it's true, we've had this very sharp decline, but getting back to zero doesn't mean we're back to where we were. It just means things have leveled out. Now, the positive readings in manufacturing do suggest manufacturing has seen some modest growth, but we're still well below where we were before the pandemic. And that will be very apparent in a number of charts that I'm going to show you after this. The second the second survey that we administer is called our Business Leader Survey. And this is focused on the service sector, the broader service sector. You can see a very similar pattern, sharp decline around when the pandemic hit back in March with some rebound. But unlike the manufacturing sector, what we've seen in the service sector is ongoing weakness. So the picture here is a sharp drop followed by ongoing decline, but just at a much slower rate. So what this suggests, and this is going to be the first of many charts I'll show you, that this has been an uneven cyclical downturn. Manufacturing has actually done okay during this downturn. It's been hard on everyone, but has performed a little bit better. But service jobs, especially the sectors that require face-to-face interaction and physical proximity, things in leisure and hospitality, things in healthcare, things in related to tourism, have really struggled and are continuing to struggle. All right, what about households? All right, so now shifting gears from firms and businesses now over to households, let's take a look at consumer confidence. And so this is another diffusion index that the University of Michigan puts out. Here, the key line is 75. So readings above 75 are consistent with, on balance, optimism over pessimism. Readings below zero are consistent with a more pessimistic outlook. And this is important because how consumers feel is tied to their willingness to spend and to make investments and things like that. You can see coming out of the Great Recession, it actually took quite a number of years before consumers really felt like they were back on their feet, felt confident in the economy. But we've had a very sustained period of time, a 6-year period of time where consumer confidence was at a pretty high level. Obviously, with the pandemic, we've seen that consumer confidence fell and it's kind of drifted right around that 75 line. It did move up nationally, but this is before the recent outbreaks. Now, the Siena Research Institute in Albany actually provides a comparable measure for the region. And we can split this between what's happening in the New York City metro and then in upstate New York. And again, the key takeaway here is that with the pandemic, consumer confidence has really been shaken. In our region, confidence fell even more than in the US overall, in part because of how hard we were hit, also in part because of some of the restrictions that were put in place here that were more, a bit more restrictive than other parts of the country. And you can see that while there's been some improvement, overall remains below that 75 threshold. And this is, again, even before this more recent outbreak that it hit the region. So how does this translate into actual activity? So one interesting thing about the pandemic, especially with the speed of the contraction, is that there's been now the emergence of a number of high frequency data sets. So what I'm showing you here is information on consumer spending from the Opportunity Insights Economic Tracker at Harvard. This is Raj Chetty's outfit. And this is daily consumer spending patterns taken from debit and credit cards. So it's not the whole universe. There's obviously cash transactions that aren't being captured here, but we've validated this against a number of different data sources. And we think the overall patterns here are pretty representative of what's happening. So what do we see when we look at consumer spending patterns? And this is all indexed to pre-pandemic levels in January. Right around the time that the pandemic hit, you can see that spending fell sharply by 30%. That's a tremendous contraction. When relief payments started in April, and I think it's appropriate to think of these as relief payments and not stimulus payments, because the goal of these payments was not to push the economy beyond sort of its potential rate of growth. It was really to plug a hole that had formed in the economy. And for reasons that I think will be clear a little later, I like to refer to these as relief payments. When these relief payments started, you can see that there was some response by consumers. Spending did increase, but even now you can see spending remains below where it was pre-pandemic in the US overall. So what about in our region? What does the pattern look like? Well, it's a very similar overall shape. First, what I'm going to do is show you New York City. Very steep decline. Again, steeper decline here than in other parts of the country. Again, reflecting how hard we were hit early on in the pandemic and some of the actions that were taken here in our state. But there's a couple key patterns here I want to point out. The first thing I want you to notice here is that spending fell much before the stay-at-home orders and the non-essential business closures went into place. And even when these orders were lifted and businesses started to reopen in late May, you can see that spending didn't just immediately return right back to where it was before the pandemic started. Now, New York City, actually was the region that had the latest reopening. So phase 4 reopenings in New York City didn't start until the end of July. When you put this all together, what this suggests is that there's more to the story here than just strict lockdowns creating challenges for businesses. People themselves are afraid, and you're not going to be able to get back to normal until people feel more confident getting out into the economy, feeling like they're not going to be getting sick themselves and spreading the disease. And so it's really important that we get the health crisis under control before we can really get the economy back on track to full strength. What about Buffalo? Well, Buffalo's got a similar picture, a very sharp decline, a bit steeper than the national picture, but not quite as bad as what happened in New York City. Through much of the summer, Buffalo tracked more or less what was happening in the US overall. Some strong rebound, but not back to where we were. Interestingly, in the early part of the fall, the Buffalo region had actually gotten back close to where we were pre-pandemic. More recently, though, and we see this generally, we see another fall off in spending, and I think this coincides with the recent surge that we're getting in the third wave of the pandemic. So what's been the implication on the labor market? So what I'm showing you here is a continuation of that very first chart that ended in February of 2020, and now the rest of the year. And again, just like a lot of the other charts that I've shown you, between February and April, there was a very steep drop. Employment fell by 15% in the US, fell by a whopping 20% in Buffalo and in New York City, a much harder hit area. Since then, we've actually had a pretty strong recovery in those first few months in the summer. This does coincide with a lot of the fiscal and monetary stimulus that was put into the economy. We had a much stronger rebound than most people expected. But since then, we've had a leveling out. And even if we were to look at where things stand as of October, which is the latest data we have, official employment data, the US is still 7% below pre-pandemic levels in terms of employment. The Buffalo region's at 9%, New York City's at 13%. I can't stress enough how huge these numbers are. In the depths of the Great Recession, the US experienced a job loss that was on par, about 6%, so on par with where the US is now. Here in our region, we were more like 3 or 4% of a job loss. So the order of magnitude of where we are now, even after all the progress we made, is tremendous. There's a lot of work left to go. So let's take a look at how this has been felt throughout the economy. And again, as I mentioned previously, this has been a pretty uneven experience for people. So first, looking at this period, February to April, the contraction, what I'm showing you here in Buffalo is where the job loss had been centered. You can see about half the job loss actually was concentrated in leisure and hospitality and retail trade. So what this highlights is that the lowest earning workers in the economy have been hardest hit by this downturn. So like most downturns, those that are most vulnerable, those that can least afford it, are the ones that are bearing the brunt of the downturn. Again, other sectors that were hard hit, education and health, these are service sectors, professional and business in the region, again, service sectors doing much more poorly than other sectors in the economy, in particular something like manufacturing, which normally during a typical cycle is what gets hit the hardest. Now, where has the job growth been since the pandemic unfolded? So the region overall has gained back about half the jobs, and it's been uneven. So we have seen a good amount of jobs in leisure and hospitality gain back, but that's only half the jobs that were lost. Education and health, again, about half the jobs that were lost. This is a key sector for the region. And importantly, you can see that manufacturing has really held its own, another very important sector for the region. But overall, what this shows is that through the initial downturn and even during the recovery period, it's been a very uneven experience. And you can see another way of looking at this and how unusual this episode is relative to other types of normal downturns is to look at initial claims. So what I'm showing you here is initial claims. This is a weekly indicator for the state of New York. Because of the pandemic, actually the state started publishing information by region, and the picture for Western New York looks very similar to this. We just don't have a historical comparison. And what you can see is there was just a huge surge in unemployment claims. These are initial claims around the time of the pandemic. And even now, here we are 9 months later, you can see that initial unemployment claims, so first-time filers, is remaining extremely high. Now, it's always the case that people are filing unemployment claims. So I've got here as a reference point 2019, but you can see we're still at a very elevated state in terms of new claims. And how does this compare to like what happened during the Great Recession? So what I'm showing you here in this brownish line is the pattern for the Great Recession. And you can see that the experience that we've just gone through and are continuing to go through is a much, much different experience than a typical cyclical downturn. And in fact, the way that we've been thinking about this particular episode is that it's much more like a natural disaster than a typical cyclical downturn. And so just to sort of help make that point, what I'm showing you here are employment paths for two very significant hurricanes. This is Hurricane Maria that hit Puerto Rico in 2017. So the typical pattern with a natural disaster like this is a very sharp decline, followed by some recovery with the rebuilding efforts. And in Puerto Rico, at about a year later, employment was back on track. Now, New Orleans is a very different situation with Hurricane Katrina. This is by far the worst, in the last several decades. Very, very sharp decline. And even today, New Orleans is not back to where it was. There was a lot of out migration from the region following that episode. Now, what does a typical, cyclical downturn look like? So these brown lines are showing you what the pattern of decline looks like for things like the 1990-91 recession, the 2001 recession, and the 2007-9 recession, which is the Great Recession. You can see it's a much smoother pattern. Usually takes a little bit longer for things to come back, but much shallower. So if I was to just take the information that I already showed you on job patterns for Buffalo, New York City, and the US and plot it here, what you can see is the pattern that has unfolded so far looks much more like a natural disaster with a very sharp decline followed by a pretty rapid increase than a typical downturn. And this is, one way of looking at the economy and helping to make sense of the very, very strong recovery we've had relative to cyclical downturns. Now, of course, a very significant concern here is that what started as a natural disaster, and the analogy applies to, say, the first wave of the pandemic, the longer that this goes on, the more likely this is that this natural disaster could turn into what would be a more cyclical, standard cyclical downturn. And that would be especially true without additional federal, support from the federal government. The longer this goes on, the more at risk I think we are for that. All right, let me end here with a bright spot and then a look forward. So, it's been the case for a number of years now that the Buffalo economy and the housing market here has actually been doing pretty well. You can see actually that Buffalo's home prices have been growing more or less on par with the US, which is not usual for the economy, and is actually a leader in upstate New York. And entering into the downturn with the pandemic, you can see that if anything, home prices have picked up. Now, of course, part of what's going on here is that we have a low supply of inventory in the region, and that's certainly a contributor to these rising home prices. But even with the pandemic, what we've seen is that home prices have held steady, if anything, picked up. So that means the demand is still there and still strong. So that's a good sign. So what's causing this? So, first and foremost, of course, low interest rates are helping. But on top of that, as I've mentioned before, this has been a very uneven experience, and high income households are far less likely to be losing their job and losing their income. So that's helping to support the housing market. In addition, there's actually some anecdotes that people from outside the area are actually looking to move to Buffalo, in part because housing costs remain fairly low here. So you hear stories of people from New York City, for example, wanting to move into the area. I've even heard some anecdotes of people from California and Texas wanting to move into the area. Now that with remote working, you're able to decouple where you actually live and where you work, at least for the foreseeable future, and that's benefiting the region. All right, so where are things going forward? So, even in the best of times, it's very hard to forecast where things are heading in the economy. I don't have a crystal ball, but what I do have are the indexes that we put in that are forward-looking, right? So this is in some sense the wisdom of the crowd. Where do businesses think things are heading over the next 6 months? So these are our future indexes, which are parallel to those indexes I showed you at the very beginning for our Empire survey and our business leader survey. And if you just look here at the very end of the period, what you can see is that manufacturers are actually thinking that conditions will continue to improve over the next 6 months. But our most recent reading, our November surveys that were just released earlier this week, suggest that service firms on net don't really expect much improvement at all over the next 6 months. And when you put the two together, I think the best we can say here is that over the next 6 months, there's really only modest improvement that's expected. And in fact, in our November survey, we have a set of special questions on the labor market. One of the questions we asked firms was when do you expect employment to return to pre-COVID levels? And overall, businesses anticipate a pretty long road ahead. So 42% of manufacturers and only 30% of service firms indicated that they're already at or above pre-COVID levels. So some firms are doing okay, some firms are even growing. Okay, about a quarter of firms in both surveys don't expect employment to return to pre-COVID levels, within the next year. But troublingly, about 36% of manufacturers and almost half of service firms say that getting back to pre-COVID levels is going to take more than a year, and some fraction of these suggest that maybe never will actually get back. So I think when you put all this together, it does suggest that we do have a bit of a long road ahead. So I thank you very much for your time and attention. I'd be happy to take a few questions on the regional economy.
We've already got one question, but I'm gonna give everybody a chance to go ahead and put your questions in, and I'm just gonna start with a comment and a question. Jason, first of all, thank you so much for your insights. It's sobering, but also I think incredibly informative. You mentioned the anecdotal stories that you've heard about people moving back to the region, and actually just on October 30th, Redfin did a story that talked about that Buffalo was one of the 3 top cities where people had been moving in from out of town. So it was Louisville, Santa Barbara, and Buffalo, and the top 3. Sorry, and the net inflow here in Buffalo increased by 107%. So that is a bright spot, and I hope we can sort of capitalize on that. But to your point about this being like a natural disaster, it really, a natural disaster, sort of the path forward is, the National Guard comes in, we spend money, and we infuse it in sort of fix what is a discrete challenge, right? But a natural disaster is really, across the country, all over. So I guess, you made it clear, getting the disease under control is really the sort of way we recover in natural disaster. But from a community approach, what should we be thinking about as community leaders to help reposition the community for economic recovery, just based on what the data is showing you?
Sure. I mean, so I would say 2 things to that. So first and foremost, I would say, some of this is beyond what a community can really just do on its own. I actually do think that, not just Buffalo, but many parts of the country are going to require a second federal aid package. And this time I think it's going to be important that we include some provisions to provide help to state and local governments in particular. And that's really something that can only be done through something like a federal government. So some of this, and I think if that happened, we've already seen one wave of that. And I think if that happened again, the analogy back to the natural disaster would continue to hold, because that would act as a lot of that rebuilding money. A lot of times when natural disasters happen, there is federal relief money, there is insurance money that comes from outside the region and into the region that does actually generate the rebuilding and help with the growth. In terms of what the community can do, I think it's important to recognize that, first of all, we will get through this. And when we do get through this, we are going to have a different economy than we have now. A lot of the kinds of job opportunities that existed before the pandemic, especially in things like leisure and hospitality and restaurants and a lot of those face-to-face physical proximity, personal service kinds of jobs, they're not going to be there right away. And the kinds of opportunities that are going to be created through this pandemic, which there will be, are going to just be different. And so I think it's really critical that we do think about things like workforce development and training to help people who, maybe were in one industry or had one set of skills, transition those skills into the kinds of opportunities that are going to be there, when we do get through this. And I think that's something that the local, community can play a huge role in. And I think Buffalo's actually been a leader in this, actually, with some of the training centers that have been set up for manufacturing here. And I think more of that kind of stuff is going to be really helpful.
Jason, the partnership we put together sort of a 5-pillar plan for what we can do as a private sector, and this whole retooling the sort of workforce for the jobs that are actually going to be here, and upskilling, reskilling with the talent that we have is one of those 5 pillars. So I couldn't agree more. We've got a question from Don Ingalls, and it's a question, a statement and a question. I heard a report that economists have said that with another $2 trillion relief package, the economy would recover by 2022, and without it, it would be a decade. Do you share that view?
I mean, I think any kinds of projections like that, I think are very difficult to make, because again, I go back to this. It all depends on the path of the virus. I think first and foremost, we have to get the virus under control. I think without getting the virus under control, any type of projection, a year, 2, 10 years from now, really just doesn't make sense. If we can get the virus under control, it stands to reason that, additional aid is going to help get the economy back to full strength faster than it would otherwise. But I don't have a good sense of what the timing differential would be with and without. I would just think it's critical that we first and foremost take the steps necessary to get the virus under control, and hopefully get to the point where a vaccine is available and we can really, get past this.
Yeah, I mean, to that end, do you think even now we're talking about third potential vaccine, that when you talk about rebuilding consumer confidence, because that really is the troubling thing when you look at this overall, it feels like that's really the beginning of true economic recovery, people having jobs and then having the confidence to spend money, there. Do you think the vaccine psychologically is enough to sort of begin to rebuild consumer confidence to help us sort of falling further into the sort of the ditch?
So I think the vaccine, the news coming out on the vaccines is extremely encouraging. I'm very upbeat about it, but I think it's important to just be realistic here. I think that really for the effects of the vaccine to start to show in the economy, there's a lot of steps that have to happen. First it has to get FDA approval. Once it's past FDA approval, we have to manufacture it, we have to distribute it, and then I think a very significant hurdle we have to cross is we have to actually have to get enough people to take it that we get the benefits of that herd immunity that ultimately will come. So while I'm extremely encouraged by the news on the vaccine front, I think it's more of a medium run solution, not a short-term solution.
Gotcha.
Now, I don't think that that's the only thing that we can be doing to help address the situation, the health crisis. I think that there's a lot of evidence suggesting, basic things like wearing masks and social distancing and washing hands and all the things that it sounds like your organization is promoting will help and make a big difference. But I think another sort of intermediate step, and where I'd like to see a lot more investment done, is in really pushing for rapid, accurate testing. Because I actually think we could get to a point where we could really have a pretty well-functioning economy, even without a vaccine, if we just knew in real time, in an accurate way, whether we had it and whether we were contagious. And if we were, we could isolate and separate. And if we weren't, we could set up a system. Everybody could wear a sticker letting everyone else know that you're fine for the day and be on with our business. And so I think there's a lot of steps we can take before the vaccine comes online that will get us, functioning and allowing, business to operate. But the vaccine will ultimately be a significant game changer, but I think we're a little ways off before that really can take hold.
So Jason, we have time for one last question, and we have one last question, so that's perfect. This one's from Ken Stone. He asks, would you comment on changes in total employment in Western New York versus New York and the US and forecasts for the future?
Well, I think, I showed those indexes during the presentation. And so the basic path has been that early on in the pandemic, New York State as a whole, and that includes Buffalo and New York City, got hit harder. That's because the virus was much more significant here. And as a consequence, there was much stricter lockdowns and stay-at-home orders put in place here than in other parts of the country. What we've seen since is a little uneven. New York City, which really is the engine of growth for the region, has actually lagged everywhere else, and is still far below where things are in the U.S. or in Buffalo. Buffalo is kind of in the middle. We haven't had quite the rebound that, say, the U.S. has had, but we're not lagging like New York City either. I do expect that. I think what you saw is that we've even though we're rebounding, the pace of growth is starting to slow. So I do think for some period of time we're going to continue on that path where we're going to continue to be adding jobs on net, but at a slower pace, unless, of course, the big unknown is what happens with the virus. If the virus continues to spike, and if, as a consequence, actions are taken either by governments to step in and put further restrictions in place, or, which is likely, households themselves will just respond by not being out and about like they normally are. I think that could lead to another wave of layoffs. And so again, the path going forward, when it comes to activity, when it comes to employment, when it comes to spending, all the things in the economy really are dependent on the path of the virus.
Well, Jason, thank you so much for your insight and for sharing this voluminous data with us. It's a lot to take in, but we appreciate your support and helping us take a finer look at where we are in our region. So thank you again for being here, and we'll see you again soon, I hope.
Okay, I appreciate the opportunity. Yeah, everybody have a happy Thanksgiving, and hopefully, again, we'll see each other sometime next year in person, and we can talk about all the progress we've made over that year. So thanks so much.
Jason. Take care.
Thank you, Jason.
I want to take another opportunity to thank our sponsors for their generous support for today's session. Our title sponsor, KeyBank, our presenting sponsor, Univera Healthcare, our event sponsors, Elderwood, Lumsden McCormick, and National Grid, and our supporting sponsors, First Amherst Development Group and St. Bonaventure University. And I want to thank all of you for participating today. And in the closing minutes of this annual report to members session, we're going to go through the process of our legal annual meeting in which we certify the ballots we received in this year's election of our board members. All of you are invited to this event every year to participate in our official legal annual meeting, but few come. The process takes 5 to 7 minutes and it's rather perfunctory. So in the interest of full transparency in our election process this year, we decided to combine the annual report to our members with this official annual meeting. So you have the option to observe and participate, or you can log off this morning. And if you leave the meeting now, I want to thank you for investing your time and energy with us this morning and wish you a very, very happy holiday.